People ask me sometimes what it felt like. 14 months inside a neutral station at the edge of compact space, surrounded by 7 species who had never once failed to bring a counterpart to terms, who had the resources and the patience and the institutional memory of 1100 years of arbitration behind them. People ask me how I held out. I tell them I didn't hold out. That's the wrong frame entirely. I showed up. Every day I showed up. And then one morning they stopped. That's the story. The rest is furniture. But the furniture matters, I suppose, if you want to understand why they stopped. So let me give it to you in order. My name is Sira Oduya. I was, for 26 years, a trade and boundary negotiator for the Human Coalition's Bureau of Interspecies Affairs. I worked 11 postings across 9 systems, 6 treaty renegotiations, 3 boundary frameworks, 2 emergency protocol agreements that required the kind of concentrated attention that takes something from you when they're done. I retired 4 years ago to a small house near the coast of a continent that gets a great deal of rain and very few visitors. I have a garden that occupies most of my mornings. I grow things that don't require much of me. I am telling this story now because someone from the Bureau's archive division sent me a formal request 3 weeks ago, accompanied by a document I had never seen. The document was a sealed internal debrief, 41 pages, filed by arbitrator Voreth Dune, first chair of the Vareth Compact's arbitration panel, the man who sat across from me for 14 months, filed the day after he signed the treaty, and classified by the Compact for 31 years under their internal security protocol. It had been declassified as part of a broader records exchange, and because the exchange pertained to events I had a first-hand role in, the Bureau forwarded it to me before releasing it to the General Archive. I read it on a Tuesday morning. The rain was coming in off the water, and the light in my house was the particular gray I have come to associate with thinking slowly and well. I sat with the document for a long time after I finished it. Then I called the archive division and told them I would write a first-person account to accompany the document's release. I felt I owed them that. I also felt and feel that I owe the people who read these things an honest accounting of what happened at Orvan Thresh, because the versions I have heard secondhand are either flattering in ways I don't deserve or wrong in ways that bother me more than they probably should. So Orvan Thresh, from the beginning. The Vareth Compact was not a government in any sense that humans would recognize immediately. It was a treaty organization, 7 species bound by a commercial and territorial framework that had been negotiating its way to dominance over the outer corridor for roughly 4 centuries. They were very good at what they did, in the way that institutions become good at things when the institutional memory of success gets passed down deliberately, and the incentive structures reward a particular kind of result. They had something like muscle memory. When a new species came to the table, the Compact knew how to read them, how long their patience held, what they needed badly enough that they would trade something real for it, where the pressure points were, and how long to press before the counterpart buckled or blew up. Both outcomes were acceptable to the Compact. A counterpart who buckled gave them the deal they came for. A counterpart who blew up gave them the moral high ground and a better deal 6 months later, when the other side had cooled and calculated their losses. They had, by the point I arrived at Orvan Thresh, negotiated 247 major frameworks across 11 decades of operation. They had never, in any record available to the Bureau, left a table without getting most of what they came for. I want to be clear about what I knew going in. I knew that record. The Bureau had briefed me thoroughly, and my own research added to the briefing. I knew the Compact's toolkit, the delays, the procedural reversals, the manufactured crises, the isolation tactics, the quiet resource constrictions that make a delegating organization's oversight body start sending anxious messages, the late-stage ultimatums with real teeth behind them. I had studied the Compact's settlement patterns across 12 comparable negotiations. I had read every available post-negotiation analysis. I knew what the compact considered a win, I knew what they considered an acceptable compromise, and I knew what they considered a concession large enough to feel like victory. I also knew, going in, what they were aiming at in this specific case, which was a transitrites and extraction framework for the Dorothy passage that would have, if accepted as offered, effectively turned human shipping through the outer corridor into a tributary arrangement. The language was elegant. The mechanics were clear, if you read the annexes carefully and did the 40-year projections. We would have paid and paid and paid, rate adjustments indexed to criteria the compact controlled, revision mechanisms that required unanimous approval from a panel they majority held, dispute resolution channeled through a process that ran, on historical average, 4 years per case. A human shipping executive looking at the headline rates might have found them defensible. A human shipping executive reading the annexes and running the projections over 40 years would have found them ruinous. That was not acceptable to the coalition, but the coalition also needed Dorothy access. Our shipping needed the passage, and the compact controlled the relevant territorial buffer. So I was sent to Orvan Thresh with a mandate that was, in plain language, get a fair framework and do not give them the tribute arrangement. Come home with something that works. Take whatever time you need. The Bureau said that last part and meant it. They backed me the whole way. There were moments, I will tell you, where that backing was the only external thing between me and a very bad decision. I am grateful for it in a way that has only grown as the years have passed. I arrived at Orvan Thresh on the 14th day of the 4th month of 2187. The station was beautiful, in the way that compact architecture tends toward beautiful, all curved surfaces and layered atmospheric panels, lit from within by a light source that mimicked 4 different stellar spectra depending on which corridor you were walking. Species comfort, maintained at institutional scale, with a precision that was both impressive and faintly unsettling, because it made you aware that every environment on the station had been deliberately calibrated. Nothing about the place was accidental. I was assigned quarters in the human environment sector, which was small but adequate. The compact had good data on human nutritional and atmospheric needs, and they met those needs exactly without surplus. I was met at the docking collar by a compact liaison, a young Kareth named Verath An, who gave me a schedule for the first week's preliminary sessions, offered me a mineral supplement he assured me was calibrated to human nutritional baseline, and told me that arbitrator Voreth Dune was looking forward to our initial exchange. I thanked him. I took the supplement. I unpacked. The first session was 3 days later. Arbitrator Voreth Dune was a Kareth, one of the founding species of the compact, tall, bilaterally symmetrical in a way that humans find less immediately disconcerting than most compact members, with 4 forward-facing eyes arranged in 2 stacked pairs, and a voice that came through the translation system at a register just slightly below what my ear expected, so that I spent the first few sessions unconsciously adjusting my attention to catch the full range of it. He was formal in the way of someone who had been formal professionally for a very long time, meaning it was not performed and not unfriendly. It was simply the mode he operated in, the way that certain tools are built to perform one function with great precision and do not strain against the work. He introduced the 6 panel observers, one from each non-Kareth compact species, ranging from the Drelathi, whom I had worked with before, to the Velon, whom I had not, with brief formality, and the session began. The first session was a preliminary framework session. Definitions of terms, scope of negotiation, procedural ground rules. Standard opening for this kind of engagement, and the compact's execution of it was polished in a way that spoke to long practice. Voreth Dune laid out the compact's preferred framework for the Dorothy transit arrangement with quiet precision across 4 hours. The key provisions of each annex explained clearly, and the underlying logic made explicit. I listened to all of it, asked several clarifying questions about specific technical definitions that I wanted on the record, and at the end, told him that the coalition would review the technical annexes and would be prepared to respond at the next session. He agreed. The next session was scheduled for 10 days out. 10 days is the first beat of the standard compact delay sequence which I had been briefed on. The mechanism is straightforward. The opening session establishes the compact's position clearly and comprehensively, and then they pull back and let the counterpart sit with it. An anxious counterpart, given 10 days with nothing to do but review a framework they find problematic, begins to feel the weight of the silence, the distance from home, the uncertainty about timeline. They start to make small concessions to get momentum going again, to feel like something is happening. The delay could run as long as 3 weeks if the compact thought the counterpart was particularly susceptible to temporal pressure. I used the 10 days to read. I had brought a substantial library, curated over several weeks before departure, history, technical material related to the Doroth region's shipping economics, and a long run of novels by an author whose work I had been meaning to get to for years and had not found time for. I read for long stretches each day, walked the corridors of the human sector and occasionally the adjacent Drelathi sector when the light was interesting, and exchanged occasional pleasantries with the coalition's technical attaché, a young man named Perrin Soltz who was stationed at Orvan Thresh to provide specialized support and who was, I could see, somewhat surprised by my affect. He had expected a lead negotiator who was in motion, planning, strategizing, sending messages, preparing position papers. I was doing some of that. I was also reading novels, and I think the novels were the part that surprised him. I wrote letters home. I slept well. I have always slept well, even in difficult postings, and I have often thought that this is not a skill so much as a constitutional fact. On the day of the second scheduled session, the liaison sent a message that Arbitrator Dune had been called to a compact internal consultation, and the session would need to be rescheduled. They offered a date 3 weeks out. I confirmed the new date and went back to my book. That was, essentially, the texture of the first 4 months. I want to be careful here not to retroactively dramatize what was, from my perspective, not dramatic. The compact had a sequence. They ran the sequence. I attended the sessions that happened, asked questions and noted areas of technical disagreement for the record, and when sessions were canceled or delayed, I did something else. The sessions happened roughly once every 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes less. In 4 months, we had 11 actual working sessions, and in those 11 sessions, we had moved approximately nowhere on the fundamental disagreements. I had stated the coalition's position on the key transitrate clauses with clarity and consistency at every session, each time specifying the technical reasons the compact's current language was unacceptable, and offering a clear description of what acceptable language would look like. Each time, Voreth Dune acknowledged my position with formal courtesy, and proposed a variation that was, in one way or another, the same unacceptable arrangement described in different vocabulary. I said no each time. I said it politely, specifically, with reasons attached. I did not say it with irritation, and I was not performing the absence of irritation. I was simply not irritated. The compact was doing its job as it understood its job. I was doing mine. I want to be precise about my internal experience during those early months because I think it matters for understanding what happened later. I was not gritting my teeth behind a professional exterior. I was not employing psychological techniques to manage frustration. I was genuinely fine. The station was comfortable. My library was large. I called home regularly. I found over time that I had opinions about the atmospheric panels in the different corridors. The amber spectrum section near the Kareth environmental block had a quality of morning light that I found genuinely pleasant, and I began taking routes that passed through it when the timing allowed. I learned the secondary maintenance corridors, which were less well lit but quicker. I made a mental map of the station that was distinct from the official map, because it was organized around what I found interesting rather than where things officially were. This, I later learned, was noted. In the 5th month, the compact escalated. Escalation 1 was what I recognized from the briefing materials as the resource constriction play. My human environment sector was quietly deprioritized in the station's supply rotation. The mineral supplements became less reliably delivered, not absent, but arriving on an irregular schedule that required me to track them. The food synthesizer in my quarters began producing things that were technically within nutritional tolerances, but were, culinarily, a significant step down from the first 4 months, repetitive, oversalted, texturally wrong in the specific way that synthesized food goes wrong when calibration is off or deliberately shifted. The ambient temperature in my sector dropped by approximately 2 degrees. Not enough to constitute a formal complaint under the negotiating party's environmental rights framework, which I had reviewed, but enough to be noticed. I ordered an extra blanket from the station's goods depot. It arrived in 2 days, a thick, dense material in a neutral gray that I found I liked enough to keep after the temperature correction came, which it did within a week of my notation at the next session. I wore the blanket some evenings even after that. At the next session, I raised the environmental drift as a footnote, a procedural note that the coalition's technical team would appreciate confirmation that the environmental maintenance schedule was on track. Voreth Dune noted it with formal courtesy and said he would look into it. The supplies and temperature normalized within the week. I have thought about what that escalation was supposed to produce and what it actually produced. The intended read was either formal complaint, an aggrieved counterpart, wounded enough to seek concession as compensation, or silence under increasing discomfort, which would tell the compact something about my tolerance for direct pressure. A footnote was apparently not in the set of expected responses. It gave them, as near as I can tell, nothing useful to work with. Escalation 2 came 6 weeks later and was more technically sophisticated. The compact convened a procedural review, a formal technical panel, empaneled under the arbitration charter, to assess whether several of the coalition's stated negotiating positions were compliant with the charter's framework rules. This was a tool the compact used selectively. Historically, it had produced one of 2 outcomes in counterpart delegations: capitulation on the disputed positions to get the review shelved quickly, or a protracted fight on procedural grounds that consumed bandwidth and momentum from the main negotiation. Either outcome served the compact. Capitulation gave them a direct policy win. The procedural fight gave them time, during which the counterpart's principals grew anxious, and time was the compact's natural advantage. I reviewed the compact's charter that night in full. It was long and carefully written. The coalition's positions were, as I had drafted them, compliant with it. I appeared at the procedural review, which was technically optional for the counterpart delegation, sat through 2 full days of technical presentation by the compact's charter counsel, who was thorough and precise, and at the end submitted a 60-page technical response demonstrating clause by clause that our positions were within charter. I wrote the 60 pages in 4 days. It was genuinely interesting work. Charter analysis of that kind requires a particular kind of attention, and I enjoyed it in the way that I have always found careful technical writing enjoyable when the underlying material is substantive. The review panel sat with the response for 3 weeks and then closed the review without finding a violation. I attended the next main session and reiterated the coalition's position on Transitrate Clause 4. Voreth Dune watched me at that session for slightly longer than his usual formal attentiveness required. The watch was not hostile, and it was not studied. It was more like the particular attention someone gives to a phenomenon that has not behaved as expected. I noted it without comment. I have thought about it many times since, and I believe it was the first moment he understood that the procedural review had not drained anything from me. He had expected, the compact's historical data would have predicted, that 2 days of charter proceedings followed by 4 days of intensive response drafting would produce something measurable: fatigue, irritability, an edge of resentment that could be worked. What he saw instead was a person who had found the procedural review technically interesting, had written 60 pages about it with apparent engagement, and had arrived at the main session rested and precise. In the 7th month, they isolated me. This was the tactic I had been most specifically warned about. The compact's expertise in species psychology ran deep, documented over centuries of dealing with the full range of sapient social structures, and they understood that most negotiators operating far from home on a foreign station, surrounded by unfamiliar species, with no organic community to fall back on, with the negotiation itself moving slowly enough that productivity felt tenuous, developed a social deficit that eventually pressured their judgment. The human environment sector was not formally closed, but the social atmosphere of the station changed in ways that were perceptible without being deniable. The liaison, Verathon, became harder to reach, messages answered after longer delays, scheduled meetings shifted by small increments. The other species at Orvan Thresh, there were several ongoing compact negotiations, and the station had a fairly full population, became less conversational. Common areas that had been friendly became merely polite. Members of other delegations who had previously been happy to exchange the small talk of shared isolation became occupied when I appeared. The amber spectrum corridor near the Kareth sector developed a maintenance issue that required it to be closed for several weeks. I found alternative routes. Perrin Soltz, the technical attaché, was reassigned in the 7th month to a posting closer to coalition space. He was young and he had found the waiting harder than he let on, and I was genuinely glad he got to leave. His replacement was a woman named Dorset Kaya, quieter, steadier, with a background in technical analysis and the kind of professional self-sufficiency that comes from years of working in environments where you are the only person with your particular area of expertise. We found each other quickly, the way people do when the population of people who share a specific kind of patience is small. We ate dinner together twice a week in the human sector's small common room, and we talked about things that were not the negotiation: her family's agricultural operation on a dry climate station, my garden, the particular difficulties of maintaining a sense of scale when you spend your professional life thinking in decade-long intervals. I called home more during those weeks. My sister, who lived on a different continent and raised animals that took a great deal of looking after, and who had opinions about everything and expressed them with great energy, was exactly what I needed during the 7th and 8th months. Talking to her was a specific kind of recalibration. Her world was immediate, her concerns were concrete, and her interest in my work was affectionate rather than professionally anxious. She had no investment in the negotiation except that she wanted me to come home, and talking to her reminded me what home was. I wrote a long letter to a retired colleague who had done a difficult 4-year posting in the 3rd decade of his career, and who knew what the long middle of these things felt like from the inside. He wrote back with more insight and less advice than I was expecting, and then sent a second letter 2 weeks later with a recipe for something that could be approximated in a station synthesizer if the calibration was close. It was not, but I appreciated the attempt. In the 8th month, Voreth Dune asked me, at the opening of a session, whether I was finding the station accommodating. It was an unusual question, not on the agenda, not framed as a procedural courtesy. He asked it carefully, with the full panel present but the formal session not yet convened, and there was something in the quality of the question, in the specific weight with which he held the silence before asking it, that told me he genuinely wanted to know. Not for the record, for himself. I told him the station was comfortable, that I was reading a great deal, and that I had found a route through the secondary maintenance corridors that had better light than most of the main thoroughfares in the morning. I told him the other members of the panel, the 6 species observers who attended every session but rarely spoke, were collectively the most patient room I had sat in across all my years of this work. And I meant that as a genuine compliment, because patience at that caliber was something I respected professionally and personally. He looked at me for a long moment after that, the kind of look that holds something in it, not quite a question, not quite an assessment. Then the formal session was convened and we proceeded. I have since read what he noted about that exchange. He described it in his debrief as the moment his confidence in the inquiry's design began to solidify. The moment he decided the panel needed additional tools for understanding what they were dealing with. I will come back to that. What I remember about the 8th month, apart from that session, is that I finished the last of the novels I had brought from home and spent a week with nothing to read, but the technical annexes I had already reviewed 40 times. I read them again. I found 2 footnotes I had not fully absorbed in my earlier passes and added a notation to my working document. Dorset Kaya, at our next dinner, observed that I seemed the same as I had 6 months ago and asked whether that was deliberate. I told her I didn't think it was deliberate. She said that was what she had thought and that she found it interesting. I asked her what she meant. She said she had worked with a lot of negotiators over her career in various support roles, and that the ones who lasted in long postings tended to fall into 2 groups. The first group maintained themselves through effort, regular routines, deliberate reframing, systems they built to manage the psychological weight. They worked at staying stable, and the work showed in the specific way that sustained effort always eventually shows around the edges. The second group was smaller. These were the ones who seemed, from the outside, to simply not be losing anything. She said the difference was visible if you spent enough time watching both kinds. She said she had been watching me for 8 months and had placed me in the second group within the first 2 weeks. I asked her what accounted for the difference. She said she didn't know. She had her theories, but they were only theories. She said maybe it had something to do with whether the thing you were doing felt, at the level where things feel true, like the right thing to do. We ate the rest of the meal without talking much. It was a comfortable silence. The synthesized food that evening was actually decent. Someone had recalibrated the texture parameters, finally, and the grain had a quality close enough to what it was imitating that the approximation stopped being noticeable. In the 9th and 10th months, the compact deployed its 2 most significant tools. The first was the Bureau. Someone communicated to a mid-level official in the Coalition's Bureau of Interspecies Affairs that the negotiation had reached a point of stall significant enough that the lead negotiator might benefit from a support visit, a strategic review, possibly a recalibration of the Coalition's position on several key clauses. The communication was attributed to a third-party observer within the Compact's multilateral framework, a mechanism that gave the Compact plausible distance from the message while ensuring it reached the right desk. It was calibrated to produce precisely the anxiety that the Bureau, which was watching a 14-month negotiation produce no visible movement while Coalition shipping costs accumulated, was most vulnerable to. It worked to a degree. I received 3 messages from the Bureau in a 2-week period. The first asked for a timeline assessment and whether I anticipated movement before the quarter's end. The second asked me to evaluate whether any adjustment in the Coalition's position might create enough procedural momentum to demonstrate progress to the shipping sector's stakeholders. The third, which came from a senior official I respected, was plainly written. The Bureau was concerned that the negotiation had stalled in a way that was no longer strategically distinguishable from failure, that the political pressure from the Coalition's shipping interests was real and growing, and that I should seriously consider whether the framework I was holding for was achievable. I wrote back each time, long, detailed responses, not defensive, because I did not feel defensive but thorough. I explained that the negotiation was proceeding on the timescale that the compact's own tactics had produced, and that the coalition's position on the key clauses was correct and should not be adjusted. I noted that any adjustment under current circumstances would be read by the compact as confirmation that sustained pressure worked, which would produce a cycle of further pressure and further adjustment that would not end where the Bureau wanted it to end. I asked the Bureau, specifically and respectfully, to trust my read on the room. The third message was the hardest to answer, because it came from someone whose judgment I trusted and who was not, I thought, wrong about the political reality. He was right that the shipping interests were paying real costs. He was right that 14 months with no visible movement looked, from the outside, like failure. He was right that there was pressure, and that the pressure was not going away. I wrote back to that message at close to midnight, station time. I sat with it for several hours first. I told him I understood the pressure, and that I was not indifferent to the costs being paid. I told him that the compact's offered framework, over 40 years, would cost the coalition a great deal more than any reasonable extension of the current negotiation, and that I had done the projections enough times to be confident in that assessment. And I told him, as clearly as I could put it, that the compact was not in a state of genuine stall. They were watching. They had introduced a message to the Bureau specifically to see if organizational pressure from coalition-side principals would produce the capitulation that direct pressure had not produced. Responding to that message by adjusting the coalition's position would not resolve the negotiation. It would confirm to the compact that the strategy worked and that they could use it again. I asked him to hold. He held. I learned later what that decision had cost him internally, and I remain grateful for it in a way that I don't have quite the right language for. The second major tool deployed in the 10th month was the ultimatum. Vorath Dune delivered it at the opening of a session, with the full panel formally convened. It was a very good ultimatum as these things go, specific, legally grounded, and credible. The compact would require a decision on the fundamental framework structure within 90 days. If no agreement was reached, the compact would invoke an emergency security protocol under the Dorath Territorial Buffer Agreement, closing the passage to coalition shipping, while a new framework was negotiated through an alternative arbitration channel that the compact had designated. The emergency protocol could be maintained for approximately 18 months before requiring renewal. The alternative arbitration channel was, by its governing rules, slower, more expensive for the invoking party to maintain, and more favorable to the compact's structural position. In plain language, if we did not agree within 90 days, we would spend 18 months paying elevated costs through restricted channels, and then negotiate a new framework from a weaker position than the one we were currently in. The downside was real. The threat was not a bluff. I listened to the full presentation. I asked several clarifying questions about the specific legal mechanism, the timeline for the security protocol's triggering, and the composition of the alternative arbitration channel. I took careful notes. I told Vorath Dune that the coalition would review the ultimatum and that I would respond at the next scheduled session. The next session was 2 weeks out. I went back to my quarters. I called the Bureau and described the situation with precision. I told them my read. The ultimatum was legally real but operationally unpreferred by the compact. Closing the passage created complications for compact shipping interests as well, because the Dorath Buffer security designation affected third-party transit rights that the compact used. The security protocol was a lever, not a preference. The compact was hoping the 90-day clock would produce the urgency and capitulation that 14 months of softer pressure had not. I recommended we treat the 90-day clock as exactly what it was, a deadline, and continue the negotiation within it without adjusting our position on the fundamental clauses. I recommended against any visible reaction that would confirm the ultimatum had changed our calculus. The Bureau agreed. The anxiety in that conversation was palpable even across the transmission delay. I understood it. 90 days with an 18-month downside attached is not comfortable to hold. I held it comfortably. I say this not as a boast, it is simply what happened. The subsequent 4 months, the 40 days before the ultimatum window expired, and the 2 weeks that followed were the most interesting period of the entire posting. On the 31st day of the 90-day window, Voreth Dune requested an informal session. No agenda items logged, just a conversation as he described it. I agreed immediately. We met in a smaller room adjacent to the main session chamber, a room sized for 2 or 3 participants, with no formal arrangement of panel tables, just chairs and a low surface between them. Voreth Dune sat across from me without his formal document arrangement, without the full panel. 2 Kareth observers sat against the far wall, quiet. He told me that in 37 years as a compact arbitrator, working across 41 species, he had conducted negotiations of every caliber: minor commercial disputes, major territorial frameworks, emergency resource agreements under duress. He said that in his experience, every negotiating counterpart had somewhere a point of accommodation, a threshold below which their stated position could not hold, not because they were dishonest or weak, but because positions are held by something and that something has limits: time, organization, nerve, resources, will. He said he had found that threshold in every counterpart across 37 years. He had not found mine. He looked at me when he said this, and he was not being adversarial or unkind. He was being genuinely curious. It was the kind of curiosity that I recognized from people who work in empirical fields and encounter a result that does not fit their model, not frustrated, not dismissive, but actively interested in the discrepancy. He asked, "Where is it?" I thought about the question seriously. It was a serious question. I told him I understood why he was asking, and that the model he was describing, position maintained through effort, threshold below which it cannot hold, was real and accurate for most situations I had seen in my own career. I had watched counterparts reach their thresholds in my presence. I had reached my own, in postings where the position I was holding was less clearly correct than this one. Then I told him that in this case, the model was slightly off. I was not maintaining the coalition's position through effort. The position was correct. I had done the analysis enough times, in enough detail, to be confident of that. A position you are confident is correct does not require effort to maintain. It only requires continuing to show up. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me whether I had ever been confident and wrong. I said yes. I named 2 cases from my career, specific, detailed, honest about what the errors had cost. He listened carefully to both. He asked how I knew this was not one of those times. I walked him through the framework analysis. Not a summary, the actual analysis, clause by clause, projection by projection. He asked good questions. Some he had asked before in main sessions. Some were new and sharper than anything that had come up formally. We talked for 3 hours. It was the best conversation of the entire negotiation, and I found myself respecting him more at the end of it than I had at the start, which had already been considerable. At the end, he said he would need to consult with the full panel. I said I would look forward to the next session. On the way back to my quarters, I took the route through the secondary maintenance corridor. The light, in the late part of the station's day cycle, was still good. The full panel convened a formal inquiry. This was not something I had anticipated. I want to be honest about that. I had been briefed on the Compact Standard Toolkit, and the inquiry, formally designated under the panel's Supplementary Review Authority, was reserved for what the Compact internally categorized as a species profile anomaly, a situation in which a negotiating counterpart was not behaving in a manner consistent with the Compact's data on that species baseline. The inquiry was, in plain language, an assessment. They wanted to understand what they were dealing with. I was notified formally that the Compact's arbitration panel was convening a supplementary process to review the negotiations dynamics and develop a more complete species profile assessment for the human coalition's delegating representatives. I was invited, and the language was precise. Invited, not required, to participate in a series of structured interviews and assessments. I said yes immediately. I told the liaison I thought it was a good idea and that I would cooperate fully with the process. The inquiry team was 3 specialists. Von Orath was a Karath physiologist, a specialist in comparative stress response biology with an extensive publication record on negotiating endurance across sapient species. His work covered the physiological signatures of sustained cognitive load and their relationship to decision-making quality under extended pressure. He was precise and systematic and asked questions with the care of someone who understood that the data was only as good as the protocol. Saros Keth was a Drelathi behavioral analyst whose specialty was social isolation effects and motivational modeling. He had developed, over a long career, a framework for mapping what he called the motivational architecture of negotiating persistence, the underlying drives that caused counterparts to maintain positions under pressure, and the specific conditions under which those drives depleted or shifted. The third member was a Velon named Oruth Vel. The Velon are trilaterally symmetrical and very still in a way that took me some time to adjust to. Their stillness is not passivity, but something more like focused attention, distributed evenly across a broader sensory field than humans use. His specialty was not described to me formally, though from the questions he asked and the notes he took I came to understand him as the integrating intelligence of the team, the one who watched the other 2 gather data and synthesized it into a picture. The inquiry ran for 6 weeks, 41 hours of structured interviews across 17 sessions. They asked about my sleep, duration, quality, whether it had varied across the negotiation, whether the isolation period had affected it. They asked about my nutritional intake and whether the synthesizer calibration variations had produced any measurable effect on my energy or concentration. They asked about my communication patterns with home, frequency, duration, functional purpose. They were interested in what the calls and letters were doing, not just that they happened. They asked about my recreational activities. I described the reading, the route walking, the dinners with Dorset Kaya, and I could see Saros Keth making notes of a kind that suggested this information was substantive rather than contextual. He asked about the novel I had been reading during the first delay period. He asked whether I had found the corridor routes interesting as navigation problems or as aesthetic experiences. I said both, and he made more notes. They asked whether I had experienced loneliness. I said yes, some, particularly in the 7th and 8th months, and I described it honestly, the specific texture of it, the ways in which it showed up not as acute distress, but as a kind of low background awareness that the social environment was thin. They seemed to find this important, and I did not understand why until I read the final report. They asked about my confidence in the coalition's position. I walked them through the analysis again in full, and Von Orath asked specific questions about the precision of the 40-year projection and the confidence interval I placed on it. I gave him honest answers, including where the uncertainty was and why I considered it bounded. They asked whether there was any version of the Compact's offered framework I would have accepted. I described it, specific language, specific annex modifications, specific rate adjustment mechanisms, and the gap between that version and the Compact's best current offer was expressible in concrete terms. Not enormous, not negotiable from my end, but not enormous. They asked about the ultimatum. They asked whether the 90-day clock had changed my internal experience of the negotiation. I said it had changed the timeline. It had not changed my assessment. Saros Keth asked whether I was afraid of the downside, the 18 months of elevated transit costs, the worse alternative channel, the real impact on real people in the coalition shipping sector. I told him I was genuinely concerned about it. I thought about it regularly. It was not abstract to me. The elevated costs fell on people who had not made any of the decisions that produced the negotiation, and I held that fact. He asked whether the concern had shifted my position. I told him it had not, because I had done the 40-year projections under the Compact's offered framework, including the worst-case alternative channel scenario, and the cumulative cost of the Compact's framework over 40 years was larger than any plausible extension of the current negotiation, plus the alternative channel period. The math was clear. Being concerned about a real cost to real people did not make an outcome that produced a worse cost to more people acceptable. He made a note, a long one. He asked whether I found it difficult to hold a position under that kind of pressure. I thought about this carefully. I told him that I found it genuinely more difficult to hold a position I was uncertain about. That uncertainty, the specific cognitive texture of it, was uncomfortable for me, and in the two cases I had described to Voreth Dune where I had been wrong, that discomfort had been part of the felt experience of those negotiations. In this case, I did not feel that discomfort. The analysis was clear, and so the holding was not, I searched for the precise word, effortful. It was simply what I was doing. It was the situation I was in, and I was in it. Saros Keth made another long note. Oruth Vel asked the last question of the last session. It came after a silence that I had learned, over 6 weeks, not to fill. He asked whether I had ever, across 14 months at Orvan Thresh, seriously considered what it would feel like to simply accept the Compact's offered framework and go home. I sat with that. I told him yes. Once, around the 9th month, on a bad evening after the Bureau's third anxious message, I had sat in my quarters and very carefully and seriously thought through what it would mean to accept the tribute arrangement and leave. I had run the projections one more time. I had thought about the shipping workers paying elevated transit fees. I had thought about my garden and my sister and my house near the coast. Then I had run the 40-year projections again, and the math was what it was. I had gone to sleep, and the next morning I had walked through the secondary maintenance corridor because the light was good, and I had attended the session and reiterated the coalition's position. Oruth Vel wrote something that took approximately 2 minutes to complete. I did not ask what it was. The inquiry team presented its findings to the full panel in a closed session 11 days later. I was not present. I learned the contents of the report much later, through Voreth Dune's debrief, and I will tell you what it found. The findings were organized under 3 headings. The first heading addressed my physiological stress profile. Von Orath's assessment documented my stress indicators across 14 months as remaining within a narrow band, elevated at specific moments, notably the Bureau message period and the ultimatum delivery, but returning to baseline within intervals he described as improbably short given the sustained contextual pressure. He had comparative data from other species negotiators in extended compact engagements, and in those cases the pattern showed a characteristic drift, baseline stress rising incrementally as the negotiation extended, producing a slow shift in the counterpart's comfort threshold that made previously acceptable conditions less acceptable, that made fatigue accumulate and small irritations register more heavily. He had expected to see that drift. My baseline at month 14 was not materially different from month 1. He flagged this as a finding he could not fully account for within existing comparative models, and noted that further research into human physiological responses to extended low-intensity institutional pressure was warranted. The second heading was Saros Keth's assessment of my motivational structure, and it is the part I have thought about most. In the Compact's behavioral framework, built on an extensive dataset across many species, negotiating persistence was understood as a function of motivational load. A counterpart persisted because something drove the persistence: fear of the consequences of yielding, loyalty to principles, personal ambition or professional identity, ideological conviction. The heavier the motivational load, the more persistent the counterpart. And the more persistent, eventually, the more likely to exhaust, because heavy loads burned fuel and fuel ran out. Counterparts who persisted longest were typically those with the deepest identity investment, and those counterparts eventually reached a breaking point, because identity investment under sustained pressure produced either a crisis of confidence or a hardened rigidity that could be addressed through different means. He had looked for that pattern in me. He had not found it. His assessment was that my persistence did not appear to be motivationally loaded in the way his framework predicted. The coalition's position was not being held by fear or ambition or identity investment. It appeared to be held by what he described as positional clarity, a condition in which the counterpart's assessment of the correct outcome was so thoroughly and regularly reinforced by their own analysis that it did not require motivational fuel to sustain. It was not that I was refusing to yield. It was that the concept of yielding was not, in operational terms, engaged. Yielding was simply not a thing I was doing, in the same way that I was not flying or breathing water. It was outside the frame of what was actually happening. He noted that he had observed versions of this condition before, in counterparts with specific psychological profiles, but those cases had resolved when the right pressure was found, the hidden motivation, or the uncertainty beneath the apparent clarity. His inquiry had applied an unusually thorough assessment, and had not found either. He concluded his section with a sentence I have thought about many times. He wrote, "It is possible that the counterpart's positional clarity is exactly what it appears to be, a function of correct analysis, sustained without cost. If so, it is the first clearly documented instance I have encountered of a negotiating counterpart for whom extended persistence constitutes not a maintained effort but a resting state." The third heading was Oruth Vell's synthesis. It was one paragraph. He wrote that the inquiry had been convened to identify the counterpart's threshold, the point below which the coalition's position could not be maintained, and that the inquiry had not found that threshold. This was not, he wrote, a failure of the inquiry. It was a finding. The threshold did not appear to exist in any form the compact's tools were calibrated to identify. He wrote that the compact should consider the possibility that for this counterpart, the negotiation had not been an endurance test. It had been an arithmetic problem. The counterpart had done the arithmetic at the outset, arrived at the correct answer, and had since been present, still present, waiting, without significant cost, for the compact to arrive at the same conclusion. He wrote, "We have been interpreting her persistence as resistance. It may be more accurate to understand it as the absence of a reason to do otherwise." The panel met for 11 days. I read, I walked the corridors. I ate dinner with Dorset Kaya, who had learned through the station's informal information channels that something had shifted in the compact's internal process, and who was quiet at those dinners without asking me what I knew, which I appreciated. On the 12th day, Voreth Dune sent a message requesting a session. We met in the main session chamber. The full panel was present. Voreth Dune opened with procedural language about the inquiry's completion and the panel's deliberation, and then placed 3 documents on the table in front of me. The documents were a revised framework proposal. It was not the tribute arrangement. It was not precisely the coalition's preferred terms. It was something between them, considerably closer to our position than to theirs, with transitrate clauses within acceptable range and a term of 20 years rather than 40. The rate adjustment mechanisms were specified clearly and bound mutually. There were no tributary structures. I reviewed the documents for 2 hours at the table, asking 17 specific questions, all of which were answered with precision. I identified 3 points requiring minor technical modification. Voreth Dune agreed to all 3 without deliberating. He had, I think, expected more modifications, and the relative smallness of my technical ask produced a moment of silence in the room that I remember very clearly. Then I told him that, subject to the coalition's formal ratification process, the framework was acceptable to me as the coalition's delegating representative. He acknowledged that, formally and precisely, we scheduled the formal signing for 4 days out. That was functionally the end. The signing was brief and formal. Voreth Dune and I signed the treaty documents in the main chamber with the full panel present and 2 bureau officials who had come out for the occasion. There were photographs. There was a reception with mineral-synthesized approximations of beverages from several coalition cultures, which were adequate. I had 1 glass of something approximating a mild human alcohol and found it close enough to be courteous about. Voreth Dune and I spoke briefly during the reception, away from the formal event. He asked what I would do when I returned to the coalition. I told him I planned a long leave and then would see. He told me I had been a difficult counterpart in a way he found professionally instructive. I thanked him and meant it as it was intended. He paused then, in the way I had noticed before the held moment before something, or after something, that he chose not to say. Then he made the Kareth gesture of respectful acknowledgement, a slow inclination forward from the upper torso, eyes held level, and rejoined the formal flow. I flew home the following week. I worked 7 more years, 3 postings, nothing as structurally complex as Orvan Thresh. The Dorith framework has been renewed twice. The transit rates remain within the range I negotiated. Coalition shipping through the outer corridor is not a tribute arrangement. Dorset Kaya went on to a distinguished career of her own. I have watched it from a distance with satisfaction. I retired. I have the garden, the rain, the letters back and forth with the colleague who gave me the right proportion of insight to advice. 3 weeks ago, the Archive Division sent me Voreth Dune's debrief. I said I would tell you what he wrote, and I will tell you the part that matters. Most of it was formal assessment, tactics deployed, outcomes, recommendations for future coalition negotiations. Thorough and honest. He gave the coalition credit where he thought it was due, and the compact credit where he thought it was due, and he did not minimize the outcome. The last page was filed separately, under the Compact's archive category for personal professional notes, not part of the formal record but preserved with it. Voreth Dune had apparently filed such notes throughout his career. The category was well established in his archive. The personal note was about me, and about what I was. He wrote that in 37 years and 41 species, he had developed a reliable model of how negotiations ended. They ended when the counterpart ran out of something: time, resources, nerve, organizational backing, or will. He wrote that Orvan Thresh had ended differently. It had ended when the compact ran out of moves. He wrote that the critical variable was not my strategy or my instructions or the Bureau's support, though all of those had been competent. The critical variable was something he found difficult to name precisely in his own language, and which the translator rendered as settled continuance, a condition in which a creature persists not through the application of will, but through the absence of any internal mechanism that would cause it to stop. He wrote, "I do not believe she was waiting us out. I believe she was simply present, still present, at the point when we exhausted our approaches. She would have been present at any later point as well. There was no later point we could have arrived at which would have found her gone." And then, in the note's final sentence, unaddressed to anyone, filed in a sealed personal record he did not expect to become public for 31 years, he wrote, "We were looking for the threshold. The finding of the inquiry, which I believe is correct, is that there may not be one, that this is not an individual characteristic but a species baseline, and that it would be advisable for the Compact to approach future negotiations with human representatives with this possibility as a working assumption, rather than an exception to be assessed case by case." That was all. I sat with it for a long time on a gray Tuesday morning in a house near the coast. I thought about Voreth Dune writing it in his office, days after the signing, being honest enough with himself to document the thing he had learned, even though what he had learned was that his panel had run out of moves. I respected that. It is not comfortable to document about yourself, particularly when what you are documenting is the limits of a model you have trusted for 37 years. He did it anyway, carefully and precisely, with no apparent concession to self-protection. I thought about Soros Keth's phrase, positional clarity as a resting state. I would not have described myself that way at the time. I would have said I showed up every day and did the work. But maybe those are the same thing, described from different angles. The work was clear. Showing up was what the clarity required. I am not sure there is more to it than that, and I am not sure more is needed. I thought about Oruth Vel writing that we were not a threshold to be found. I thought about what it means to build your professional understanding of a counterpart around finding the thing that will move them, and then to sit down across from something that does not have that thing, or does not have it in any form your tools can find. I thought about how that feels from the inside. I have some sympathy for it. Then I closed the document and went out to the garden. The late afternoon light on this coast has a particular quality in the long part of summer, a slant and a warmth that I have been meaning for several years to sit and watch properly, without moving, until it goes. I haven't yet gotten around to it. I will. I am not going anywhere.